All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to CHRTC 309, which is Sociology of Youth and Religion. All right, so kind of rounding out a little bit talking about sex and religion, I want to delve into maybe a little bit of a odd and slightly, maybe a little uncomfortable topic, but I promise not to get too explicit about it, which is a kind of tech effect, right? And this is something that interests me in particular because I'm really interested generally in the effect that technologies, internet technologies especially, are having on young people. If you come and take sociology of youth with me, this is definitely something that I'm deeply kind of interested in. We spent the last month of the course almost talking more or less just about this. So I'm interested in this kind of question, and this kind of came up by looking around and ended up finding a paper on posted through the National Institute of Health in the U.S. about this particular topic. So I thought I would share the findings here with you and just kind of lay out a little bit what's at stake here and why I think it's actually kind of interesting. Okay, so why is this a question, right? Well, I mean, one of the principal reasons I think is that ultimately when we talk about the pervasiveness of media technologies, right, especially the internet and especially things like mobile phones, smartphones, they've fundamentally in a lot of ways transformed huge parts of our society, right? As I think we talked about at the beginning of the course, right, when we were talking about Jean Twenge and her kind of take in iGen, smartphones are kind of the defining characteristic of Gen Z, and pervasive internet access for younger millennials and Gen Z has been something that's been, around, really since they were children, right? Something that really has dominated their lives. And I think for the most part, it is something that most Gen Z youth wouldn't be able ultimately to imagine a world without, right? They can't imagine a world without pervasive internet access. Now, of course, that's not true for everybody, but I think it's mostly true. So, of course, along with this has come a ton of access to explicit material, right? I think this should surprise absolutely no one. One of the things that we find a lot on the internet is pornography. Now, again, it's not that pornography has never existed before. Pornography has been around. There's some people that suggest there's cave paintings that are essentially, pornography in cave painting form. I don't think it's quite that old, but porn is very old and has been around for a very long time, right? Images or things that are there specifically to get people around are not new. Certainly, if we go back to the middle part of the 20th century, with the advent of publications like Playboy, we definitely do see that pornography is something that has been around and has been pretty common for quite a while. Now, what honestly though does distinguish the modern era from previous eras, or the late modern era, the era in which we find ourselves in, is the pervasiveness of pornography, right? It is now, a mere few, and really since the beginning of the internet age, but especially in the kind of age of, what you might call Web 2.0. I don't think anyone's used that term in a while. User-generated content. Certainly we see pornography much more widespread. And it's gone to places like the hub sites, right, which are run by MindGeek, a country ostensibly anchored out of Montreal, though I don't know much about it. The tube sites, right, Pornhub and these sorts of porn sites that have become really, really pervasive and really, really easy to access. It's also bled down, obviously, into things like OnlyFans and user-generated pornography sold for a profit. So it is much more prevalent than it ever was. It's much easier to get your hands on, right? There was a time where you would have had to get the magazines at some seedy, X-rated bookstore or sex shop or something like that, and now pornography is widely available with a couple clicks and very little filter on it. Okay, so when it comes to youth, right, this means there's much more available. It used to be hard to get, now it's incredibly easy to get. And so the question sort of becomes, I'll read what's on my slide here a little bit. This access through the internet makes it much more likely that they will access pornography. And we see, right, that this somewhat old data from the GSS, 62% of males and 32% of females, between 2008 and 2012, who are 18 to 26, had viewed pornography at least once in the last year. And I say in my note here, I suspect significant social desirability bias. Because I suspect that people are always a little bit reluctant to say that they view pornography, especially particularly frequently. And this is up significantly from earlier waves of the GSS. Like if we go back to the 1980s, it was only about 45% of men and 16% of women. So much lower kind of stats on the whole. So it's more pervasive, right? And I suspect, if we're talking about 2012, we're still really talking about the beginning of the smartphone era, right? I guess smartphones come out in 2007, really, with the iPhone. But they don't really gain a huge amount of steam until about 2012, at least according to Twenge and Jonathan Haidt. So, after that, I suspect these numbers will have gone up considerably even more, though I don't have any updated numbers here. I've seen numbers as high as 92% or 93% of males, 18 to 26, having viewed pornography at least at some point, and it's a 60-some% of women. So the percentages of people who consume this type of content are very, very high. Okay, so one of the things that we do know as well is that high religious salience tends to be negatively correlated with porn use, right? So people who report that religion is very important to them are less likely to be viewers at all, or particularly frequent viewers of pornographic material. Okay, so this kind of interesting study came out, and this was the one that I grabbed that was on the National Institute of Health in the US's website, from Samuel Perry and George Hayward. Now, I think to surprise no one, they got the bulk of their information for the paper from the data from the National Study of Youth and Religion in the first 3 waves, and the paper was published in 2017. It's about 6 years old. So, what's interesting here? Well, one of the things that Perry and Hayward suggest is that most of the time when people have looked at the data, they found a correlation, right? There is a correlation where more religiosity tends to lead to lower porn use. And so most people have set religiosity as the independent variable, right? That as religiosity rises, porn use decreases, and it is the direction of causation here is from from religiosity to porn use, right? The more you increase someone's religiosity, the more their porn use declines. But what Perry and Hayward say is that few people have considered the opposite direction of correlation, right? Could porn use, they ask, diminish religiosity? And here's where I think this is really kind of interesting, at least interesting for me. It comes down really to the question of secularization, right? Suggesting that maybe pornography and pornography use contributes to overall the secularization of individuals, therefore contributing to people moving from a category like religiously affiliated, maybe marginally religiously affiliated, to religious disaffiliation, right? To either being nothing, none, nothing in particular, or maybe atheist and agnostic. We don't really know, right? So I think this is a really interesting question to ask, because I do think, like, in the context of kind of the technological landscape that we live in, with so many more things available, right? There's often a sort of connected commentary, right, between information and secularization, right? And this I see frequently in the literature. I see it frequently in student comments as well, that with access to the internet, right, a lot of possibilities open up for have a broader mind, to see more ideas that are dissimilar to yours. The world is sort of opened up in terms of so much content that we have to consume, that you can't fit everything that you could possibly consume in a 24-hour day. Like, there's literally no way to, live your life, have a job, be a student, whatever it happens to be, and consume all that content. Now, porn obviously is a little bit different. I think it's a type of content that obviously people find extremely appealing, right? Maybe not on a moral level, but certainly on the level of just what it is, right? It's obvious that it is something that a lot of people are drawn to in lots of ways, but it's part of this flood of content that's come out in the world. And it's also part of this kind of content, I think, and the paper doesn't speak to this, but this is where the question is really interested to me. That super individualization, right? Where there is this sense that whatever you want is sort of available to you. Now, as it goes, this is probably way too much information, in the sense that I've read a lot of the literature on pornography, because it's a topic I've talked about in sociology of youth for years now. And one of the things that you do find in the literature is that pornography tends also to move along with broad trends, right? That there are broad trends in the kind of things that are produced, the themes, the ideas, and all of this sorts of stuff. So while you can find anything you want, it's also something that's kind of mass and crowd driven, so it's not as niche as we tend to think it is. So, and yeah, like, there's definitely, I know, it's not Angela Dworkin, it's what is her name? No, it's Gail Dines, who I think has what I would describe as one of the worst jobs I could ever imagine. Dines is famous for, like, surfing the front page of Pornhub and just documenting what she sees in all of the videos. So I kind of lost my train of thought there for a second. Well, we think that it's deeply customizable. It does follow some trends, and Dines has cataloged the trends very, very deeply. Again, I think this might be the worst job available to any human being. But it is this idea that, what if our media is secularizing us, but in ways that it's just, I think, flooding us with content that might be, pushing us away from religion. Maybe for the authors here think reasons of shame might have to do something with it, right? That religious people feel ashamed and therefore, kind of drift away from religion. And I think that's at least a feasible sort of position to take. But to me, this also opens up the question of other forms of media, right? Like, if they are sort of flooding out with other kinds of content, and religious content just can't keep up, right? And religion offers, less of a compelling sort of a set of content than, say, pornography or TikTok or some other form of content that people, really seem to be into. Does that leave us with a lot of space for being religious, which remains, I think, difficult in some ways, right? Which remains kind of difficult in the sense that it's time consuming, and it's slow, and it's thoughtful, and it's kind of boring at times. All things that media that are meant to excite us, whether it be video games or pornography or TikTok or social media, are not. Now, I mean, I don't want to sound too much like a conspiracy theorist either. I don't know that this is a conscious plot by anybody, to flood the world with entertaining things, but just a function of late modernity, maybe that might lead to secularization and lead to the nuns, is less about, potentially, and here's where, I have some questions, and I think pornography offers an interesting, maybe, way to think about this. It's more that it creates a sort of deficit of attention, where people don't have time to be religious because, you pick up your phone, and how does Sherry Turkle put it, right? You can always put your attention somewhere, and you never have to be bored. That's one of the things that smartphones promise us. But what if it's entirely in that boredom, in that lethargy, that religion itself is sort of born and cultivated? And I think that's a kind of really interesting question. Certainly, right, I think this is one that Stark would be broadly supportive of as well, in the sense that, right, when he talks about the fact that a lot of, the new religious movements that have come out in the world ultimately emerge from the wealthy, right? From people who have a sort of leisure. Now, we have a lot of leisure now, but as opposed to, say, John Wesley or the Buddha or St. Francis of Assisi or any of the, the religious figures of the past who became, in a sense, spiritual masters, we don't have a lot of time and attention because our attention is soaked up by, TikTok. I don't want to blame TikTok for everything. It is to blame for everything, but I don't want to blame it for everything. But like everyone else, I'm not immune to scrolling through my phone. I don't have TikTok, but I have YouTube Shorts, which is basically the same, and just scrolling through a bunch of videos that are pretty dumb and kind of a waste of time. But I wonder if, and again here, I don't know that pornography is alone. It just soaks up time, and it's more appealing because of its excitement. Maybe the endorphins it generates, dopamine, whatever kind of mechanistic psychological thing you want to say causes it. It's so much more exciting than anything that religion has to offer, whether it's meditation or reading a holy text, right? Whether that's the Bible or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita, any of these things, right? They're less exciting than TikTok. I mean, and I remember, Neil Postman, who was a late 20th century. He dies in 2003, but so he technically makes it the 21st century. But I always consider him more of a 20th century figure, and he was a curmudgeon, a man out of time. I think even in the late 20th century, he did not like computers or television, for example. And one of the things he suggested in a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business, which I think in a lot of ways is a prophetic book, that religion can't ultimately match how entertaining the rest of the world is, and attempts to do so ultimately transform it into something quite different. So what does Postman say, right? And a very famous quote from the book, which is on my shelf, which is behind me, but I won't take it out and read it, is that, I'm sorry if I get it wrong, I apologize to the ghost of Neil Postman. He suggests that Christianity, so he's talking about Christianity here, is a serious or I believe Christianity is a serious and demanding religion. When it's presented as easy and entertaining, it becomes a different kind of religion altogether. And I mean, what he's getting at there is like, any attempts, and I know, because I've had students who've pointed me in this direction in the past to like Catholic or Christian TikTok, or even like, I'm fairly familiar and deeply entwined with Catholic Twitter for a variety of reasons. And the reduction of Christianity to like a 30-second TikTok video or arguments through tweets, does broadly sort of impoverish it in general. So it can't compete, right? It's less entertaining fundamentally, and even like whatever Catholic TikTok content remains less entertaining unless you're really part of that tiny niche than the rest of TikTok, I think. Anyway, this lecture is ostensibly about porn, but I think it, in thinking about maybe porn's secularizing effects, potentially, it's worth thinking about these broader secularizing events or effects that might be present in other kind of media that, while they might not be sexual in nature, right, where porn really is, share something that they are attention sucks, right? They are attention bandits. I should probably choose my words carefully when talking about this subject. But they're attention bandits, right? With the potential to pull our attention towards things that the sort of lizard brain, part of humans, finds really, really appealing. But ultimately might kind of take us away from other things that make us human or potentially make us human, in terms of religion. And again, I am sensitive here to Steve Bruce's kind of notion that anyway, I do think it's worth kind of thinking about this question of just, are these media so appealing and now so pervasive, so easy to get to, that they draw our attention in ways that maybe religion just can't. And, and maybe if I'm being a Starkey kind of person, I'm saying, well, the market for religion just hasn't adjusted, and it will, and we'll come up with religion that's just as entertaining. Okay, maybe that's possible. Or it'll highlight different benefits of religion. I'm open to that too. But it's, for me, it's the question, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward here. Okay, so just some quotes from the piece, and it's in one of these continual pagination journals, which is why it's numbered 1759. Basically, yeah, comparing 4 different national data sets with measures of pornography consumption. They put the consumption rate somewhere around 60 to 70% for men report viewing pornography in the past year, and 20 to 30% of women in that 18 to 23 range in the past year. Now, I don't know that I love in the past year. It's not a great measure for me. I'd like to see past month, past week, these slightly more granular kind of descriptions. That tends to work better for me in general. But that's neither here nor there. Numerous studies have described the social correlates of pornography among the general public. Okay, so who are the populations that are most likely to be consumers of pornography? So they're younger. Okay, makes sense. Male. Yep, males are much more likely to consume pornography. In general, males are much more likely to purchase sex as well, right? So, no surprises there, I think. Less politically liberal, right? So Democrats in the U.S., more likely to be warm to pornography. Again, I think no surprises there. Sexually permissive, right? So they're more likely to view fewer boundaries around what is sexually permissible. Slightly more educated, right? Some college or more. Non-white, so minorities, along a couple of different patterns, and less religious by a variety of different measures. So, that tells us something interesting, I think. Okay, so when we talk about, the major religions that we have in Canada and the US, right, we're really talking principally about various forms of Christianity, Protestant Christianity, evangelical Christianity, which not everybody splits off from Protestant Christianity, though, frankly, they really should. Roman Catholicism, of course, and then, Judaism and Black Protestantism as relatively minor traditions, but definitely still there. We can say Islam is growing, especially in Canada, as well. Now, when it comes to all of these religions, right, they all have relatively exacting standards with regards to sex. Certainly, compared to the relatively loose standards of late modern culture, right, all of these are pretty exacting on the whole, right? Much more demanding than the culture. So typically, from a Christian, Protestant Catholic point of view and Jewish and Islamic point of view, right? Sex is something that can only be seen as legitimate and is only legitimate within the bounds of heterosexual marriage, right? So in order to have sex, you have to be married, and marriage, in this case, does not include people of the same sex. So, and I mean, the limits for, what is seen as licit when it comes to sexuality are fairly strict as well, right? My knowledge of kind of pornography and Islam is somewhat limited, though my assumption has always been that, Islam finds, the use of pornography to be something that is not permissible, haram, I believe. There might be some debate on this. I know certainly in Christian circles and in Jewish circles, there's ways that these things are debated. So, I mean, let's just, within, say, the context of Roman Catholicism, for example, pornography use is seen as a grave sin, right? Something that would necessitate going to confession or not being able to, be saved or receive communion or any of these sorts of things, right? Because any kind of sexual act outside of marriage, when it comes to Catholicism, whether that be premarital sex, extramarital sex, masturbation, anything like this, is all, seen as gravely immoral. Protestantism, the standards aren't as consistent within Protestantism, but it's pretty, common in Protestantism, though I don't think this theology is as defined, to think of, pornography as a misuse of the sexual faculties. I mean, in Roman Catholicism, it goes down to things like natural law, right, and this sort of Aristotelian Thomistic notion that everything has a telos, right, that everything in nature that's created by God has a purpose, right, and the purpose of sex is reproduction, so anything sexual outside of reproduction is seen as illegitimate. Okay. Without getting into the depths of Catholic theology, which is not why we're here. So, I mean, all of the dominant religious groups in America are at odds, with increasingly permissive attitudes about pornography. And I mean, this tends to be, I think, known at a sort of popular level, though for the most part, right, when it comes to actually within these religious traditions, it's not spoken about, on the level of the laity very often, right? It's sort of everybody knows that it's not allowed, but it's not like, people are hearing sermons from the pulpit about, the evils of pornography or anything like that, right? But it does exist kind of at the level of people just know what the rules are for the most part. It's passed down to them in some way. And obviously, the culture since the 1960s has become increasingly permissive of different forms of pornography, right? In a sense, you can thank Hugh Hefner, right, the founder of Playboy. He was a bit of a degenerate, but whatever. For this, right, the just kind of gradual movement of the lines when it comes to, sexuality, and pornography especially. Larry Flynn, who was at Hustler magazine, and had very famous cases put against the magazine where pornography in the U.S. was found to be a constitutional right under the First Amendment. But all this has sort of like shifted the line over till now. I mean, really, there seems to be a wide sort of cultural acceptance that pornography is just there and there's nothing we can do to stop it. And, it's probably good anyway, so we shouldn't stop it. Or if it's not good, at least a large percentage of us like it, and so we don't want it to be any harder to access. I mean, for instance, in Utah, a law was passed recently that would have required any site housing adult content to verify the ages of anyone who wanted to enter the site, which would have required people to log in, right, and to verify with some form of identification. Now, given the fact that in order to, sign my kid up for an account on Rocket League, I had to, show Epic Games my identification. I thought, what's the big deal? If I have to do it to play Rocket League, then I don't really see the problem that people should have using pornography. But it caused quite a storm in the media and at a popular level, with people objecting to, the idea that, oh my God, someone would actually know who they are and their pornography consumption habits. So increasingly permissive ideas, but also does seem to be a wide cultural shame that, people sort of all probably expect that everybody else is using pornography. Nobody wants to talk about it or admit to, the kind of pornography that they're using, or that they're using it at all. So, one of these things, it's kind of odd. So permissive, and religious groups are at the far end. They're the ones pushing these laws. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, were the ones pushing these laws in Utah against pornography and making it harder to access. So definitely at the far end. Okay, so when we talk about the major studies, right, all of them have shown a kind of negative correlation between religiosity and viewing pornography, right? As well as the frequency of viewing pornography, right? So the more religious you are, the more religious things you do, prayer, religious service attendance, all those things we've been talking about, of course, the more or the less likely you are to view pornography, right? So, a few minor studies, right? So there's always those minor studies that find something slightly different. It's often down to methodologies or the kind of questions they asked. Of undergraduates have found weak to no correlation between religiosity and pornography habits, which essentially suggested that this is so pervasive ultimately. It's so pervasive ultimately that religion wasn't a kind of barrier. Everybody was viewing pornography, from the very religious to the not all religious. Now, that's a minority of studies, so we shouldn't read too much into that. Okay, so looking at kind of other studies, the authors found basically two other studies where pornography use amongst those who are religious, is associated with a greater degree of guilt. So the one they cite most is Grubbs et al. Right, and a quote from the piece, right, in the event that they become somewhat regular users of pornography, harsh reactions and pathological interpretations would be likely. So basically, right, and I mean, this is, I think, pretty universally true from my sort of casual observations. I don't want to say that this is a scientific sample or anything, but from my kind of casual observations of sort of the evangelical and Catholic sort of discourses around porn and pornography use, one of the things that I will say, and one of the things I definitely find very interesting, is that pornography use is almost always pathologized, right? That it's very much kind of structured mentally as a disease, right? It is something that is wrong with you. It is something that needs to be treated. It needs an intervention on the scale of alcoholism or gambling addiction or any of these kinds of things, or at least it threatens to kind of rage out of control like addictions, right? So, this is a pretty typical reaction. This is, I think, an obviously very extreme reaction, and one that I don't know is particularly helpful, to a young person that maybe is finding themselves compelled to use pornography for whatever reason, right? But I have certainly seen that a lot of religious communities will put it into the same category of addiction, right? And I've even seen, again, this is anecdotal, so I wouldn't want you to take it as kind of hard evidence. The sort of statement that I am a porn addict and I will always be a porn addict, right? Like, um, and stressing therefore the sort of strict abstinence model of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Like counting days without and worrying about relapses and all of these sorts of things, right? So I mean that pathological language definitely present, I think, in religious communities in a lot of ways. The harsh judgments, so Grubbs and all suggested harsh judgments could eventually lead to detachment from one's religious group. Um, and now, what the authors here say is that a significant number of young Christians who admitted to using pornography suggested that the use of this material hindered their spiritual relationship with God. And this was, 43% of males, 20% of females felt that it worsened their relationship with God or Jesus. And 20% of males and 9% of females reported that pornography caused them to lose interest in spiritual things. Again, like kind of anecdotally, I've heard, sort of people talk about this. This is what happens when you're in like when you sort of float around and take in some of these accounts from, Christian and quasi-Christian spaces. I remember hearing a few years ago, it was on a podcast hosted by Matt Fradd, who's a former apologist with Catholic Answers, and now he runs his own podcast called Pints with Aquinas, which is, it's decent. I don't follow it closely, but I remember he had a podcast with a secular atheist called Love People Not Things, and they had interviewed someone, a woman who had found herself compelled to use pornography and had so pathologized it that basically she completely quit her faith and was considering moving and becoming a porn actress herself, because she felt like that was, the only path that was open to her as someone who used pornography, as a woman especially, that it was so abnormal that there must be something wrong with her and she should just engage in it by becoming a porn star, essentially. So we can see that this pathological language, is a problem. But, a big percentage of those, in this kind of study, 43% of males, 20% of females said it worsened their relationship with God, and 20% of males and 9% of females reported that pornography caused them to lose interest in spiritual things. I do think this is interesting, and this is maybe going back a little bit to the point I was making a few slides ago. Is it just, like, it could be guilt, right? And it could be they feel no longer worthy of the love of God or whatever, right? Or it could be that it just crowds out space that otherwise might be occupied by spiritual things, right? But they lose interest in spiritual things, right? Now, I mean, Mark Rigneris, in his book Cheap Sex, has also suggested that, especially among those who reported being politically liberal, right, that sex often also takes on this sort of spiritual quality. And especially in sort of middle class, non-religious women, that their sex lives, ultimately take on this sort of religious connotation, and they define a lot of their identity through their sex lives and, how many partners they've had, who they're having sex with, a sexual identity, whether that's, kinks or an LGBTQ identity, all of these sorts of things. But it is definitely something that is present, and Rigneris talks greatly about the fact that, in some ways, a sort of religizing of sex happens, especially in those who are irreligious. So that might be part of what's going on there, right? That people, who start using pornography ultimately gain that, or start attaching more value to that, and it's certainly, more tangible in a lot of ways than religion is. and might kind of start attaching a sort of spiritual meaning to that. Or it pulls them away from spirituality towards a different kind of identification, and things like this, right? So I do think that that's a possibility at very least. Okay, so we have pretty strong bodies of evidence from social science, right? So from criminology in particular, um, that religiosity is correlated generally to someone holding more conventional moral beliefs. Right, and I mean, this kind of makes sense when we talk about, I mean, I think we sort of mentioned it when we talk about life outcomes, right, and the moral codes, and why, young people who are religious, when it have that kind of morality that tends to be socially valued. Because, we are in a Western society, and Western society and its moral codes fundamentally were shaped by Christianity, right? For good or ill, right? Depending on which position you take. And so, people who, because the kind of things that are typically morally valued in Western culture, for the most part, are ultimately, in some way, I don't want to exaggerate it, tied to Christianity, right? Honesty, hard work, all of these sorts of things tied to a kind of Judeo-Christian ethic, for the most part. Again, with limits. And yeah, I mean, I think strong bodies of evidence suggesting that if you're religious, right, you hold those values, and because they're socially valued and they've been so ingrained in kind of the fabric of the West, that ultimately, yeah, these are the moral values that tend to be, I think, held sort of broadly. Okay, there's also a strong body of evidence suggesting that, especially from criminology, suggesting that even minor forms of deviance erode religiosity, right? That as people start to engage in deviance, they start to become less religious. And this has mostly been put down to what's called cognitive dissonance, right? That you can't align, your moral, your actions with your morality. We see this a lot in kind of communities where deviance happens, right? And I mean, this is Travis Hershey's social control theory, right? Travis Hershey's social control theory. This idea that, deviance ultimately puts your morality at risk, right? Why? Because as you become deviant, like, people can't live with a sort of, for the most part, it's really difficult for people to live with the sense that they are doing something wrong, that they might be the baddie, right? This is something that people do find, I think, quite difficult at the end of the day to absorb, that they might be the baddie, right? Sorry, I'm being a little bit silly. But the idea that they might be somehow morally less than is something that people find really hard. So what do? They justify, right? They find justifications for their deviance, right? They find justification for acting in particular ways that ultimately sort of allows them to be in the majority, right? Like, or to be in the right, I guess, rather would be the thing. So this cognitive dissonance, that you're doing something wrong, and that yet maybe you like it, maybe you don't feel like it's wrong, maybe it feels good. This kind of cognitive dissonance tends to erode in the direction of the behavior, not the belief, right? So religiosity erodes because, people are trying to justify their actions. Okay, so yeah, the effects of porn viewing, varies by age for 3 subjective religious dimensions. So that's importance of faith, closeness to God, and religious doubts, where we see the negative effects of pornography viewing more pronounced for 13 to 17-year-olds and weaker for those 18 and over, right? It's not surprising, right? 13 to 17-year-olds are more malleable, behaviorally and intellectually, considerably. The effects of porn viewing also don't appear to vary for measures of attendance and prayer frequency, right? So, or by age, right? So basically for attendance and prayer frequency, the effects are roughly the same for 13 to 17-year-olds. Again, it's in a negative direction overall, but there's no kind of differentiation. Religious practice. Religious practice, on the other hand, appears to decline evenly for both groups. Adolescents, those still in the home and under moral influence of their parents and religious communities, experience greater guilt and cognitive dissonance associated with porn use, right? So younger people are going to experience worse effects, right? They're probably trying to hide it more. They feel more guilty. They're having more trouble justifying it. They're still kind of going through kind of becoming their own person. So ultimately, right, it's not surprising that we see the differences in these categories. Yeah, so in 5 measures of kind of religiosity or religious outcomes, if you were, religious service, attendance, prayer, commitment, belief, and closeness to God, pornography use was related to a decline in all 5 of them over time. Again, not surprising, I think consistent with what I've been saying so far. Okay, so yeah, I mean, what the author has ultimately come to as a conclusion is that pornography use is one of a number of factors, right? So what they saw kind of in the sample was that youth are secularizing, right? And what they suggested was there was at least a correlation between pornography use and increased pornography use and a decline in religiosity, right? Now, the nice thing about the National Study of Youth and Religion, obviously, is that the National Study of Youth and Religion is longitudinal, right? And so it follows the same people over the 3 or now 4 waves of the National Study of Youth and Religion. So, what does that tell us? Well, basically, it has the advantage of having measured the same people, right? And you can find the same person in the sample, so they're all going to have, basically been given a unique identifier. So you can compare, individuals over the course of this project. So, pornography use, one of a few factors that might be leading to increased secularization. Now, one of the things that the authors will say, and there's a lot of caveats on the discussion and conclusion section of their paper. But one of the caveats certainly is that this is not the only factor, right? That pornography, it's not like, you watch porn once and you were like on your way to the convent one day, and the next day, you are a stripper in Atlantic City. That's not how it goes, right? You've completely lost your faith in God and all that thing. Again, like most things, it's a really gradual process. If anything, it's going to be a really gradual process, which is, something. And it's not, porn use isn't like a magic bullet that causes people to lose their faith. It's one of many things that's happening. I mean, amongst other things, right, that we might want to note in this study was that the sample remains overwhelmingly Protestant and Catholic, right, with minority faiths hard to distinguish, simply because they're too small. So there's that as well. A lack of qualitative data, right, in terms of allowing people to explain what happened to them, remains, and porn research remains challenging for a number of reasons. The biggest one, nobody wants to admit their porn use. Go figure. So, and a couple of things that I would also want to say here. I wonder here, and this is more of a question than something I have an answer to, whether the pervasiveness of devices has changed considerably. Like, we know it has, right? The final wave, the third wave of National Study of Youth and Religion was done in 2014, 2015. So, as technology goes, it's dang near ancient, right? 10 years on from the end of the third wave, the environment, and especially the number of devices, has proliferated in significant numbers. Those with access to the internet, where someone could be viewing pornography, have exploded, if you will. They've exploded out, obviously. So, follow-up studies or future kind of studies on this, I would suggest, I would suspect, if this effect is there, we should see an acceleration of it as, the proliferation of pornography has just increased, and its availability has grown exponentially. So, I think the conclusion is, when it comes to, religion and sex, that pornography definitely seems to have a kind of interesting effect. It does seem that there's a correlation. And again, the direction of the correlation is a little unclear, but it's certainly plausible, I think, that it's certainly plausible, I think, that use of pornography might be leading people away from religious faith. I think that's perfectly plausible, and the paper's authors suggest that it's backed up at least by the data, though the directionality of that causation is still a little bit in question. It requires more research, and I think qualitative research especially, to get the accounts of young people and what their entry into kind of a greater use of pornography might ultimately have heralded, right, in terms of their religious faith.